notice. We are very grateful to you for that, and we proceed from the fact that you are those people in your countries who are responsible for decision-making in the area of digital diplomacy. Yeah, the people who are developing certain concepts of digital transformation and who are writing publications and regulations and documents. The other people who are supporting those who are decision makers in that area. Saying that, I would like to pass the floor to Oleg Shakirov, the moderator. He is expert at the Center for Advanced Governance. Thank you so much, Oleg, for moderating our session. Thank you so much, Daria. I'd like once again to thank the Gorchakov Fund for arranging that session, and we have an excellent panel, and I do think that we will spend that time great. Let me make an introduction as to how we are going to arrange the discussion. After that, we'll introduce the guests. The guests will take pitch. After that, we'll take my role of a moderator to ask some questions. After that, we'll collect the questions from the viewers, and you are free to ask questions following the live show on the YouTube. We're going to speak about digital diplomacy. In essence, this term is nothing new. We're speaking about digital diplomacy for at least a couple of decades. Quite recently, when we celebrated the Day of the Russian Internet, the Foreign Ministry said that it was the very first ministry which launched its own website, and now that the United States spoke about the ICT use in the work of the State Department's activities, and this discussion goes on for quite a while, but still there is a feeling that this is a new field, a new domain, not only for the people, but especially for the diplomats. No, and actually, there is a stereotype about diplomats as being quite conservative, not flexible, and digital world becomes a kind of challenging for them. Another peculiarity of digital diplomacy is about the following. Over the last decade, we were speaking about digital diplomacy as solely a component of public diplomacy, but nowadays we see that digital technologies impact not only the public side of the diplomacy, but other aspects of it as well. I'm very much pleased to have such a broad range of experts, and we'll be able to touch upon different areas as to how digital technologies may affect diplomacy. Let me introduce to you our today's speakers. We're glad to be joined by Sergey Kiryushin, Ambassador at Large, representative of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia for Digital Transformation. Mr. Kiryushin actually joined the Russian Foreign Ministry less than 1 year ago, and he plays an important role in promoting digital transformation in the Russian Foreign Ministry. With us is Mikhail, Petrosyan, advisor to Director General of ANO Digital Economy. And we have three remarkable foreign speakers. Nicholas Cull, professor of Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, University of South California. He is the author of a remarkable book, or a series of remarkable books. One of them concerns public diplomacy in the digital age. Next one is Matthias Luefkens, founder and CEO at DigiTips. Also, he is the author of Twiplomacy, and he is the author of different overviews as to how social media is being used in diplomacy. He is an ex-head of digital media at the World Economic Forum. And last but not least, our panelist, Pawel, Surowiec, senior lecturer in public relations and strategic communications, University of Sheffield, author of a number of very interesting academic books on communications and digital diplomacy. I'd like to pass the floor first to Sergey Kiryushin. It happens so that the moment is opportune. The Russian Foreign Ministry last week adopted its digitalization strategy, for instance, offering certain services for the citizens, updating of their in-house processes. Mr. Kiryushin, How do you see the role of the Russian Foreign Ministry in terms of digitalization and how it may affect the Russian diplomacy in the midterm? Oleg, thank you so much. Actually, digital transformation, which was announced by the mass media, and it caused some feedback. That's a program which was adopted by the Russian Foreign Ministry in compliance with the Russia's government's instruction to introduce some ministerial and sectorial transformations, digital transformations. This is only a part, a tiny part of the digital systems of the Russian Foreign Ministry. In essence, it concerns two socially important public services, granting of foreign IDs to the Russian citizens who are residing abroad, and it is also true of other functions, such as procurement of personal computers, which are not part of our in-house systems. It is also related to ICT being installed, so it means that this is just a non-core part of the Russia's foreign ministry activity. This is just a tiny part of what the Russian foreign ministry does in promoting digital transformation, because most of the digital systems operated by the Russian foreign ministry are either confidential or top secret. Besides, the program also is inclusive of the development budget. It is a kind of a request, or this is the aspiration of certain ministries how to promote the digital transformation strategies. They include several projects, for instance, setting up analytical system to support the foreign policy activity, or something related to chat bots, etc. Actually, these projects being announced still are not funded yet, so there is not funding provided for them. In order to get necessary funding, to get the budget for that, certain feasibility study has to be prepared. These projects have to be approved and endorsed by the Ministry for Digital and the government, and has to be agreed by the Finance Ministry. Therefore, we are dealing with that, and certainly we are doing that, but the progress is quite slow. Apart from that ministerial program, which touches upon only a part of our IT assets and IT systems, besides that, we have some in-house programs. And there is no endorsement as to what we're going to do with that. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs has not come to terms, has not agreed within itself what to do about that. So once we integrate all these pieces of this patchwork, suddenly it will be related to the confidential part of the information system, so my response would be quite limited. Thank you so much, and certainly we do not ask you about the secret part of the information systems. But to elaborate on what you have already said, probably you can share something which has already been done. Can you tell us what opportunities are there for better use of IT technologies in the Russian diplomacy? Well, this is something we have to define within the Russian Foreign Ministry. We are about setting up a working group which will define the conceptual backbone or baseline, conceptual design of our digital transformation. And once it is ready, we'll provide an answer where to go and what would be the vector for the Russian Foreign Ministry's development. But still, we came up with understanding that in order to go further, to progress, we have to go more digitally. You have to work more with analytical data. I've already mentioned that there is an aspiration to set up an information and analytical system which would support our foreign political activity, and it will rest on the open source data and many other sources of data, and it would be very handy, very helpful for the diplomats to draft certain documents and to support decision-making for diplomats. So this is actually probably all I can tell you. Thank you, and I do think that we'll touch upon that issue later on. Next, I would like to pass the floor to Matthias Luefkens. Matthias, if you don't know, he is a frequent author of different publications about the current status and the current landscape of the global diplomacy. Probably he is the best expert in telling us what social media is most popular among diplomats and what countries are not part of Twitter network yet. Over the last 10 years, we saw that more and more countries actually get out of the digital platforms. Why? For diplomats, for the countries, it is so important to be part of the social media. What they get out of that? Is it a better source of communication, or this is something different, or is it a tool to promote their national interests?
Thanks, Oleg. Thanks for having me. Hello, everyone. Good question. Obviously, the answer is both. It's quite interesting that you're holding this session now. It's actually 10 years almost to the day when Carl Bildt, the former Swedish foreign minister, exchanged a public tweet with his Bahraini counterpart, Khalid al-Khalifa, publicly asking him, I would like to get in touch with you on an issue. At that time, his Bahraini counterpart didn't reply the same day. Actually, he replied, I think, 2 or 3 days later, saying, oh, nice to hear from you. Your tweet caught the world's attention, obviously, because it was the first time you had two foreign ministers communicating publicly on a social media platform rather than communicating privately, or rather going through the traditional diplomatic channels. Now, this is a decade ago. 10 years have passed since this first digital diplomatic exchange. Obviously, nowadays, every single government in the world is present on social media platforms. There's only 3 countries which are not yet on Twitter. I can name them. It is North Korea, Turkmenistan, and Laos, who don't have an official presence of their governments on Twitter. On Facebook, you have a couple of 3 other countries. It's 6 in total, which are not present, namely also some of the Pacific islands, because the issue, obviously, it takes time, it takes resources, it takes money to manage a good social media presence on the different platforms. It's not just something that you do, at the end of the day, just fire off a tweet. No, there's a whole, countries and governments have, foreign ministries have large teams of digital, of community managers. And then, of course, in each embassy in the world, the embassy tweets in the local language or communicates in the local language to the audience they want to touch. So kind of, for me, it is absolutely obvious that governments and especially foreign ministries have to be present on social media channels and on the social media channels of their, for embassies that are most used in their host countries. Obviously, for one, it's really kind of to connect with those audiences. Nowadays, it's not enough to read the newspapers or to listen to the radio or to watch television to understand what is happening in that country, because most people are using social media platforms. So if you want to hear what they are thinking, if you want to feel the temperature, you have to be present on those platforms. And obviously, being present on those platforms helps you reach out to these new audience beyond the traditional leader-to-leader exchange. So, I think it is absolutely vital to have, to be present on the platforms. And then also, not only institutionally, like with institutional accounts of the foreign ministries, but also on a personal level. So, we've seen very early on, 10 years ago, Barack Obama had really interesting exchanges with then Russian President Medvedev, who was also active on Twitter. Unfortunately, as we all know, this good relationship, has kind of suffered over the past years because of different international conflicts, not necessarily digital conflicts, but this digital relationship, really has suffered. And what we see now is basically countries, sending rather undiplomatic messages on the platform, be it from the foreign ministries or from selected embassies, which really kind of are not really conducive to a kind of digital diplomacy exchange. So I think, especially as we see it on Twitter, the relationship really has suffered, and it's hard to see how this newfound, since we have, the pandemic has pushed us even more into these digital Zoom meetings like this one, how we can reestablish, those relationships, because what we've seen over the past year, especially, is that actually the digital diplomacy activity on social media was much less than before. For example, the UN General Assembly in New York in 2018, 2019 was very active with behind the scenes digital diplomacy activity, even on Instagram, with Instagram stories, etc. Nowadays, or this year in 2020, we didn't see that exchange. And I think, this is quite interesting, that while Zoom calls might bring us closer because we see each other in the eye, we're staying maybe more focused than in normal settings. I think, these digital exchanges, are not as productive as they were before. And there's one thing I'm a big fan of, is obviously, and Mr. Ambassador mentioned those, the kind of the back channel diplomacy that you can actually do on social media, namely on Twitter, by this direct Twitter messages that you can send, between the foreign ministry of one country to another. Those are kind of private exchanges. We don't know what is going on there, but I know it is happening, and I think this is a really interesting channel, because they're different to the usual diplomatic channels. So basically, my wish for the future is that we have more collaboration, cooperation on the issues that where we can agree on, and on social media. And the pandemic is a great example. How to make sure that the whole world is safe. Obviously, is it a tool to wield power? It depends. Some countries think it is really important to have the most followed world leaders, and I think this is currently the Prime Minister of India. But frankly, does it really matter? I don't think that the number of followers is actually relevant. I think what really matters is the quality of your followers. And here I'd like to point out the Foreign Ministry of Iceland has a very small, relatively small Twitter account, but is really well connected with other world leaders. But also, obviously, the Russian Foreign Ministry is also trying to connect with other world leaders. And the new US administration, which wants to reestablish contacts after the 4 years of hiatus under the former president. Well, guess what? I have a big problem with the new administration, because they haven't really used social media to reach out, especially Twitter, to reach out, to follow their peers, to follow even allies and friends, and not even to mention any relationship between the State Department and the Russian Foreign Ministry on Twitter. So I think this is really key to re-establish those diplomatic channels. It will really help, I think, to create a better understanding between countries.
Thank you so much, Matthias. You noted that there may not be digital relations between the State Department and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but we do have examples of cooperation. A couple of years ago, on the anniversary of the meeting on the ELB, where the Soviet and the American troops met at World War II, the embassies of Russia and the United States noted that event on Twitter, despite the fact that there was some heated exchange between the ministries. So that was one of the examples of this cooperation, and that's why I'm happy that you mentioned that. Now I would like to give the floor to Professor Nicholas Cull. We spoke about the last decade, a decade where we saw diplomacy getting digitized. And since you are a historian, you've also done a lot of work studying the history of communications influence on world politics. Here's the question I would like to pose to you. Do you think that today's info revolution is something new? And to what extent we should really see that influence on diplomacy and politics of digital is good or appropriate? Thank you.
Thanks, Oleg. Well, I'm delighted to be asked to speak at this event, and I see the maintenance of contact and anything we can do to further mutual understanding between Russians and Americans as essential for the stability of the world. And I guess in this meeting, I get to be the American. I was glad to have the questions that accompanied the invitation, and we'll try to comment on each of those. But I want to start by saying that you're quite right. As a historian of the media, my chief response to the spectacle of not only the coming of the social media to diplomacy, but the chaos associated with that coming is to say, well, here we go again. And by this, what I mean is that I think there are cycles of disruption that are associated with the coming of new technologies to world affairs. We always have, and the cycle kind of works like this. To begin with, we have the new technology, and it's seen as offering something special, something which will save the world even. And then you find that an innovative nation state will start using that technology to display their modernity to the world. Then there's a moment where people adopt the technology, but they use it simply to do what the immediate predecessor technology was doing. And then you see a moment where people are reconciled to the new technology, they understand it, they know its limits well, and it becomes a stable thing. And you know, I could talk about how that worked with radio, motion pictures, television. Each went through that kind of phase. But the problem is that as this process is going on, it brings tremendous disruption. And mass media has the ability to stir up populations. And I think new media can do this more effectively because large populations have yet to develop the understanding of the media that they require for, if you like, a healthy skepticism, to be able to filter the information, to understand what needs to be, you know, they say in English, taken with a pinch of salt. How do you learn to read between the lines in a new mechanism of mass communication? And to be honest, I see a quite frightening association between new media and major crises, especially when the major crisis happens at the same time as economic problems. And this is not generally noted by historians because we tend to understand crises in terms of geography or the personality of leaders, and not the technologies, especially not the media technologies. I think we should really talk about the war of the popular press rather than World War I or the Kaiser's War. We could think about the war of radio and newsreel rather than Hitler's war or World War II. And certainly the Cold War was made worse by the coming of television. That's part of how McCarthy is able to stir up people in the United States. So we can see these new media technologies making existing crises worse to such an extent that perhaps it was through the media that they became impossible to contain. And by the same token, a return to sanity, a return to stability has to include efforts to understand media and integrate them into the process of peacemaking. And for this reason, I'm currently looking at a study of, I'm working on the role of media disarmament in the later years of the Cold War. And I want to set that alongside the current fixation we see in many governments of media armament, building up strength in the media. And my fear is that the instability associated with the transition to social media is going to boil over into still more dreadful events than we've seen so far. And I see this discussion, the discussion we're having today, as a foundation for understanding. And so I would proceed with that in mind. So now to the questions. Is social media a tool of influence? Well, I think it certainly is, but remember, influence is not remote control, and publics have an underlying responsibility for their thought and action. Social media made me do it will not be an acceptable defense in the court of history. Can online negotiations replace face-to-face negotiations? Well, regarding regular diplomacy, and here I'm thinking about the sort of face-to-face behind-the-scenes work of diplomats rather than their public diplomacy. I think we can see how over the past year, use of video conferencing technologies especially has increased. I've been part of interesting discussions with diplomats who say that they've realized through moving exclusively to digital platforms, they've realized maybe for the first time the importance of meeting people in the corridor or chatting to people in the line for security or breaking for lunch and having some words over food, that they can see that these human encounters, these quiet and daily encounters with their interlocutors are incredibly important. Low pressure encounters help them build trust, and without them, they feel that their work is much harder. I would assume that video is going to be part of negotiations going forward, but that the ideal format will be a hybrid format so that they're doing these negotiations over video links, but these are extending pre-existing face-to-face meetings because they can't replace the face-to-face. And periodic face-to-face meetings, I think we're seeing that they're necessary in order to maintain trust. Thirdly, what are the benefits of using this and the threats of using this in actual decision-making? I think that we need to understand that this is a new technology. There are always going to be benefits and threats, and this is why we need to understand thoroughly the distortions, the specific distortions associated with new technology. And here I'm thinking of the work of Marshall McLuhan, where he said, when a new technology comes, something is going to be amplified. There's going to be a distortion. There'll be something will be recovered. Something will be repressed. We need to understand how these work for whichever new technology we're talking about. Fourthly, what about relations with IT companies? Now, here, I think this is a very, very important question. I believe that we have to recognize power when we see it, and power without responsibility historically has always ended badly. I think you can also see from history that power is never lightly resigned. If we want the IT companies to show more responsibility, we need to push, and we need to work with the organizations capable of regulating them. And those are going to be legislators and legislatures around the world. And now, many countries, you see this moment where an IT specialist is brought in for questioning by legislators. And wherever you look, we can be shocked by the lack of knowledge that legislators show about the new technologies. I think we need to do what we can to better inform our legislators, and we should not assume that the tech giants will voluntarily behave properly. So my bottom line is that we live in a world where reputation is now a central dimension of foreign policy, and that the interconnections of digital diplomacy are part of the mechanism that has made reputation so much more important than it was even a few years ago. This means that protecting our reputation, the reputational security, if you like, of the state, has become a vital concern. And this is not just about the appearance of being a good state, but about a reality. And I believe that if states want the best digital image, they should work not just for the best digital, not just for the best digital communication, but the best realities. And a positive image is based on positive realities. The challenge of new media technologies are part of this. And frequently our adversaries are using digital channels to undermine reputations. Sometimes hostile messaging from outsiders can, however, guide us to genuine problems. And to me, when I'm asked by people the best thing they can do to push back against negative things that are being said about them online, the first thing I say is that the most important counter-propaganda strategy is not to fulfill the negative stereotype of you that others have. So striving to be our best selves and to actually have positive realities to underpin our images, I think is an important dimension of moving forward. Anyway, I'm sorry, Oleg, there's so much in there. I hope we can return to some of those points in the wider discussion. But thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Professor Cull, for your speech. I really liked what you said, that in your speeches with diplomats you heard the opinion that many of them truly realized the value of face-to-face meetings in real life after most of the communications had to be moved online. That's a very important comment. And now I'd like to continue our discussion and give the floor to Pawel Surowiec. In your articles, you are writing very actively about the modern media landscape and about the growth of populism and the use of social media by popular politicians can influence this environment. This question I would like to pose to you is as follows. Is it possible to pursue diplomacy in this environment, or is now our diplomacy in the digital environment is turning into constant scandals that go on and on?
Okay, thanks for having me. Sorry, there was a bit of a delay on the English channels. So yeah, I'm particularly interested in the relationship between digitalization and contemporary populist politics, because I think populist politics basically teases out and shows us quite a lot about the amplification that Nick was talking about. So this adoption and adaption of social media is somehow symptomatic to something that myself and Ilan Manor, a co-editor of my book, describes as the latest wave of the politics of uncertainty. So if I was to be an academic about the politics of uncertainty, I can offer obviously a definition of what I think politics of uncertainty actually is. And it's basically a political sensibility that foregrounds new and complex realities of a heteropolar world that is characterized by the simultaneity of the weakening of a global leadership, competitive struggles of regional power, highly polarized interest of political actors, and the crisis of governance modes focusing on perpetual crisis. And as a way of thinking about international politics, uncertainty in these settings is amplified by fragmented realities of global hybrid media landscapes and by incoherent incalculability and indeterminacy of the outcomes of diplomatic statecraft. And instead of just looking at how diplomats adapt the social media and what is it they use it for. There are kind of questions that basically myself and other academics that working within the paradigm of social theory and its connections with social media. And we basically try to find the connections that answer the questions, so what? What does it mean that we basically adapt social media into the context of diplomacy? And there is a kind of plenty of answers there that already have emerged in terms of trying to understand the politics of uncertainty and the impact of digitalization on diplomacy. First and foremost, one of the things that we have discovered through some of our studies, specifically using and adapting this notion of hybridity, is the sense of credibility and significance of digital spaces, particular digital spaces, to diplomacy. So, for example, Donald Trump has been using his own private, you can call it corporate account, on Twitter to basically tweet and engage over 80 million Twitter users in discussions about issues of foreign policy. And the status of the space itself is kind of interesting because it's not officially a recognized diplomatic space. And the credibility, obviously, in diplomacy is a cornerstone of reputation that Nick was talking about. And in that respect, even the status of particular digital space and where diplomacy is being talked about is one of the unintended consequences that I think increasingly diplomats are going to have to think about, not because of where the diplomatic conversation, not only because of what is being said about particular countries, but also where the conversation actually takes place. And that's also related to another interesting phenomenon that is being picked up by empirical research by scholars, namely the engagement with diplomatic issues through social media with public diplomacy and the notion of online diplomatic participation. This is something that had existed in a scholarship on political communications. It kind of has been talked about conceptually in the context of public diplomacy, but now we're kind of looking for evidence. What drives online diplomatic participation? Who are the actors, exemplifications of this online diplomatic participation? I just would like to bring up a campaign that was launched in the Netherlands, the campaign that was basically a reaction to the appointment of Donald Trump as the President of the United States, and his initial inauguration, the 17th of January 2016. And the day after that campaign, the Dutch satirists launched, first of all, a video and then basically a commentary. And this particular video was called Every Second Counts. Couple days later, this video was picked up by a German satirical show called Neo Magazine Royale. And basically it was turned into a pan-European contest in the first place, whereby countries, individuals, activists produced a particular type of videos that were basically assumed the form of a meme. And it was turned into a kind of international contest. But the significance of that particular campaign is not in the the significance of that particular campaign lies in the humor. That was one of the main strategies. But the significance of this campaign also lies in two things. First of all, it basically demonstrates on a very international scale that digital online participation is a thing because of enormous amount of followers that this simple contest had. The amount of comments we're looking at in some of the studies that I'm currently involved with, they basically reach out over 500,000. So the corpus of the data and the commentary is incredible. But what I also am trying to point out is that it also, social media breed new forms of activism that diplomats are going to have to be increasingly aware of, monitor, and think about social media not only as a space where you basically put out a particular types of messages about one's own countries, one's own values and policies, but also a space that also enables you or enables diplomats virtue signaling. In other words, shifting of trends, shifting of thinking about particular issues and topics. And in that sense, the changing role of social media might be also very interesting from a perspective of trying to use it as a spaces for detecting particular trends. So I'm also kind of involved in a couple of other studies that use the notion of hybridity, basically looking at the interplay between populism and the governance and attempts by, for example, Poland to regulate using legal means particular types of language and phrases that are very, very sensitive to Polish citizens from a perspective of history. And this is an example of actually a very counterproductive way of using legal means to address issues of historical significance that are perceived as undermining country's reputation, because one single country cannot regulate, and this is becoming apparent, one single country cannot regulate digital media spaces, nor it has got ability and capability to actually police not only the traditional broadcast media, but also digital media content. And in the context of our conversations, in the context of those questions that you colleagues have sent us in the run-up to the event, you ask questions about the threats and opportunities that are kind of associated and affiliated with digital diplomacy, or digitalization of diplomacy, as I prefer to call it, because it's a kind of ongoing process, and some of those digital tools will be invented and reinvented as we go along. And I think one of the biggest opportunities for any government and for any country is to basically build a coalition, cyber diplomatic coalition, and start thinking about ways in which diplomacy can actually contribute to a more balanced relationship of power in developing a relationship with those digital media companies. I think this is, from a perspective of digitalization of diplomacy, one of the biggest opportunities. And on that basis, reputational advantages can be built, thought leadership can be built. On that basis, I think new forms of political engagement and participation can be built. And potentially this is a way forward and a way of overcoming some of the challenges that we are seeing, some of the disruptions that Nick has been talking about. So this new wave of politics of uncertainty is kind of driven partly by unregulated digital media spaces that initially, as Nick highlighted, were basically a space for advancements of knowledge about foreign policy. There was a certain dose of curiosity about them, but increasingly we are basically seeing an enormous process of disruption. And last thing that I just would like to point out, and I'm happy to share this study with everyone. It's not my study. I just happened to encounter this study that I'm obviously going to be using and citing in my work. It's a study that basically came out literally 2 days ago, and I just thought that I'll share it with you as a kind of interesting insight. It's a study that was published by Helmers and other colleagues, and basically it's a study that focuses on 10 European countries. And it's a study of the perception of misinformation and disinformation. And amongst the countries that are studied are Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Spain, France, Hungary, Netherlands, Poland, and Switzerland. And basically what the study finds, and this is particularly significant from the perspective of thinking about the publics in digital public diplomacy. In this context of the politics of uncertainty, what the study finds, and I think this is particularly useful, is that across all countries, participants, and this is a study based on a survey, experience relatively high level of unintentional communicative untruthfulness or misinformation. And disinformation in the information environment is experienced to a lesser extent. And this basically means that the difference between disinformation and misinformation, according to this study, is both significant in terms of perception, but also statistically significant. What is also kind of important to keep in mind is basically ways in which the findings of this study have been kind of divided into clusters. And those clusters basically indicate ways in which, just bear with me 1 second. Yeah, there are noteworthy country-level differences in the levels of perceived misinformation and disinformation. And looking at the score of the differences, looking at the score of differences depicted in this particular study, overall participants in Western and Northern European countries score relatively low on both dimensions, and perceptions of disinformation are substantially less silent than perceived disinformation. In Denmark, Sweden, and the Netherlands, participants even score under the midpoint of the scale for both perceived and misinformation and disinformation. The second cluster that has been uncovered in this study indicates that mostly certain Eastern and Southern European countries where average disinformation and misinformation perceptions are above the midpoint of the scale, and the distinction between perceived inaccurate news reporting, in other words, misinformation, and the perceptions of bias and dishonest media reporting disinformation is less clear-cut. France is the only exception of a Western European country that basically falls into the category closer to Eastern and Southern Europe. I just think that basically it's a kind of a vivid illustration of where are we at in terms of thinking about news and ways in which we approach media landscapes and media environment in this context of politics of uncertainty. And I think those insights are kind of very interesting because we can start thinking as public diplomats about understanding particular publics in the very, very specific contexts. Anyway, that's everything that I kind of wanted to share with you today. Happy to answer any questions if you might have any.
Thank you so much, Pawel. I think that you shared some very critical remarks, and certainly it would be very curious to look not only at the European scales and scores, but also the global ones. But let us continue. There is one more speaker left, Mikhail Petrosyan. Nicholas Cull and Pawel Surowiec already spoke about the interaction with the global platforms and global digital companies. Against the backdrop of the digital diplomacy, we are speaking about technological diplomacy, and among the pathbreakers, we find Denmark, because the government of Denmark even launched such an institute as Digital Embassy and established a position of digital ambassador, Pavel Kruger, who assumed the position in Microsoft, which sends us a very controversial message about interaction between big companies and governments. Michael, what do you think? Can we develop relations between the governments and huge digital companies in the context of the digital diplomacy? Oleg, thank you so much, dear colleagues. I'm very glad to be present in such an August meeting. And it's a privilege for me to be able to speak about such a very important topic. As Oleg has stressed actually, there are some differences in terms of the terms. Digital diplomacy may mean just an ICT track. For some, others say that digital diplomacy, this is a sector connected to the communication between the foreign ministries and the citizens in terms of rendering certain services in digital form. Sergey Kiryushin, in his pitch, told us about what elements are there in the digital transformation strategy of the Russian Foreign Ministry. This is about digital granting of IDs and other services rendered. This is a story, in essence, about certain elements related to the use of the digital technologies. Once the country promotes its foreign policy, this is about the use of digital technologies for governance, for management. When actually your management is data-driven, when you understand what data is available. These are the elements which are present in the business media for quite a while, and I do think that in the Russian context, the potential for interaction between the government and business on diplomacy is not exhausted yet. We have just scratched the surface of it, and there is a big room for improvement. And Sergey said that a working group is going to be set up in future for the development of digital diplomacy in Russia. I do think that would be very expedient, very right to engage business in that, as far as they can offer lots of very good products for the Russian digital economy. I can use the terms which gained a lot of hype, such as artificial intelligence, which in essence may mean machine learning, and neural networks. This is everything related to data science. I think that business can advise us on certain concepts and on certain decisions and solutions as well. It was quite illustrative for me to look at artificial intelligence. Our American colleagues, I'm sure, are familiar with the final report of the National Commission for Security, which is related to artificial intelligence. National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, that's the proper name. So we advise everyone, I invite everyone to get familiar with that, because this is a very good case, very good example of very well-funded work on that. And this is again an example of a cooperation between business and government. This working group was chaired by Eric Schmidt, and it engaged guys from Amazon, from Oracle, and the government, realizing that business is very much advanced in terms of their grasp of the artificial intelligence, because business is more flexible and could engage certain expertise. And therefore, actually, the government decided to embark on the experience, to build on the experience in order to promote their own policy. I think this is a very good case to replicate. Once we can take advantage of the products and solutions and the experience of the business, it would be just great. I can name certain companies which we can engage, but look at combating pandemic COVID-19 in Russia, and we held a separate briefing in the diplomatic corps. We told the audience how the public authorities and the business are combating the pandemic. I do think that we already have this cooperation there, and especially it is true of how the foreign ministry may realize what vector has to be pursued. I do think that we have to get advised by those who are competent for the digital technologies, the ones who may advise us of the best development scenario, so that we meet the challenges of the future. I do think that such cooperation is very much realistic, is very much possible. Once the work with data is built, in compliance with the requirements of the 21st century, with the current year, especially in the light of the digital transformation which is being endorsed by the Russian government. So we may juggle with different terms, but still there is an aspiration to promote digital transformation. And that means that a data-driven approach is inevitable in the work of every ministry, of every industry. This goes on in every country, and I'm sure that data diplomacy will be quite popular in Russia as well. I will not elaborate on that further, but once the ministries and departments understand better what data are available there, and if these data can be used in their work, if this data can be visualized in order to visualize and to use that not only for the inner management and governance, but to communicate that through the social media, I think that it would improve the transparency of the ministry, of the department, and it would certainly improve the efficiency of the decision-making. All these things certainly cannot be possible without necessary workforce. Business may share their expertise on that, and business may share some workforce with the ministries as well. I know that the ministries and other agencies and academia, the diplomatic academy first and foremost, are investing heavily into advanced training or retraining of the career diplomats, so that they get some training on digital skills. And as far as actually, this is not about the ability to work on the social media, although this should be promoted as well. This is a story related to the fact that our colleagues in the embassies, those who work in the field, could understand better the digital technology.
Вопросы обсуждаются сейчас на абсолютно всех площадках. Вопросы искусственного интеллекта сейчас.
And this is happening on all platforms. So these are the issues discussed by the Council of Europe and by UNESCO. And one has to understand, at the top level at least, what's at the forefront right now in terms of the kind of discussions that are going on between countries. And this will require, without a doubt, that we need to acquire new skills and competencies. We would need to acquire new personnel potential, human potential, to understand how to work with the data and how to make this work in the most effective way. I think this would be where I would stop for now, and then if there are any questions, I would be able to provide comments later on. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Mikhail. Dear colleagues, we have several questions from the audience, but first of all, I would like to take advantage of my position of the moderator. I would like to ask my question first. The question I have is based on this speech by Mikhail, and I would like to maybe address it to Matthias, Andrei, Kiryushin, and others. It's about the personnel, it's about people. To what extent the introduction of digital technologies in diplomacy would require the diplomats to have or acquire new skills, and how can diplomats do that? Matthias told us that in some embassies and ministries, they have teams that are responsible for maintaining social media. Are they professional diplomats, or are they professional IT and media campaign experts? And also, Mikhail spoke about the work with data and the understanding of the digital landscape. To what extent are those important for diplomats? And to what extent the diplomats know how to deal with that? Matthias, can you be the first one to address this?
So basically, it's all about training. Everybody thinks, oh, it's easy to send a tweet, just type a couple of sentences and hit the send button. No, it's I think it's much more complicated, and we really have to make sure that we train our diplomats. I'll give you two great examples. One is the Israeli Foreign Ministry. They have a training program for their cadets, the new diplomats coming in. They're all trained in digital diplomacy and on the platforms, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, really to understand how do you engage, how do you reply, etc., etc. So basically, because every one of us, even if, not just for a foreign minister, for an organization, for a company, if you're on social media, you become an unofficial spokesperson. Obviously, in the diplomatic service, much more. Every single junior diplomat is a representative of his or her country and an unofficial spokesperson. So great engagement, or great courses we see there in Israel, but also the Belgian Foreign Ministry, really kind of brings their diplomats into the social media world, helping them to understand how it works. And then basically when new platforms come up, such as TikTok, well, you kind of have to sit together and then wonder, what do we do? Should, the foreign ministry be on TikTok? Will the foreign minister do a TikTok dance? Probably not. I haven't seen any foreign ministry really kind of, making an impact on TikTok. But for politicians, TikTok is a great platform. Why? Because they will basically have a new, younger audience, which will go to the polls in a couple of years' time. So it might be a good idea to engage them and to be present. And you don't have to make a fool out of yourself on TikTok. Look at Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, French President Macron, or Sheikh Mohammed, the ruler of Dubai. They all have a very official presence on TikTok already. So it's basically understanding the platforms, and as I said before in my introduction, it's really, really training. And what I hope also, very often I conduct these trainings, and what happens is that the minister or the person who actually, is certainly a little bit older, unfortunately, is not there for the hands-on training that I conduct. They will all be there for the introductory remarks, but then unfortunately they don't stick around. And this is where I really think it's important. We also have to teach our parents, our peers, how to use these platforms, and that's the same also in organizations. I want everyone in an organization to understand the power of social media engagement.
Да, ну и тот же вопрос.
And the same question, I would like to direct it to you, Sergey. From your experience over the last year at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or maybe from your past experience in digital transformation in other countries, to what extent do employees need to be knowledgeable about these things, and how can this be organized? Is it through training, or is it something that can be done through their practice and everyday work? Without a doubt, everything depends on the policy of the agency towards social media regarding the number of accounts they should have and what kind of social media they should prefer. And if you want to advance your presence, the presence of the MFA on social media, then of course, the only option now is to train, provide comprehensive training to all of the employees who have to go to the media with a certain kind of message, with a certain agenda. They need to be trained, and we need to monitor what they do. And over the next several years, I think that's what we should focus on, or be focusing on, until we have created certain platforms or tools that will simplify in a great way and automate to a certain degree, and will digitize the way diplomats interact with each other via social media. When everything is fact-checked, when the content is validated for its alignment with the organization's policy. So you're not allowed to upload a video on YouTube until YouTube has verified its compliance with certain standards, whether there is any inappropriate content on it. And the same thing would probably happen if foreign ministries will be expanding their presence on social media, on the internet. And if that happens, that will definitely require us to develop certain solutions that would allow us to have some control over a greater number of diplomats going into the network, into the internet. We need to understand how this is happening and analyze this and get some feedback and continue monitoring how to develop this field. These are the same activities that apply to the development of neural networks and AI, artificial intelligence. The reason I'm saying this is that if we need to expand our presence online, and natural segue to that will be the digitalization of this process, all the way up to talking heads that will be appearing on screen, but they're not essentially live people, but rather they are going to be digital twins of your staff members or some celebrities. Well, that's in a nutshell what I wanted to say. Thank you so much. And I really liked your very last comment, because right now they are discussing the issue of using deep fake technologies. And the experts community is saying that there are a lot of scenarios where one could create a digital copy of a public speaker. And if you do that, you could get some tactical advantage or make a statement that should probably not have been made, and that could affect a political situation. This kind of screening would be required, or maybe we would have to put um, a mark that would indicate that this is something that was created digitally. I'm sorry for interrupting you, but let me just add that maybe we'll have to start thinking about how to protect these accounts from hacking, so that you would know that it's really the representative of the foreign ministry who is speaking and not someone speaking on his behalf. And maybe for that, one would require to take certain uh, solutions or decisions that will be based on blockchain or something along those lines, something that would allow us to sieve through this information to avoid any negative reaction or an outburst to some fake statements made that way, and possibly even maybe our colleagues from abroad will also suggest to us, maybe there are some standards that will be required. And I wonder if they are standardizing or making attempts to standardize electronic or digital diplomacy. If we're talking about offline, there are certain standards that exist there. They have been developed over centuries of diplomacy. Every country has embassies, and there would be receptions there where you can go and attend. There are certain sets of tricks and approaches diplomats use in different countries. But as for the digital world, for the online world, we don't really see whether everyone needs to go on Twitter, or whether one account per agency would be sufficient, or whether everyone on the staff should have an account on social media. I wonder if there are any movements that have been made on the international level or in Europe regarding certain standards in digital diplomacy. I wonder if I can ask our colleagues. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Sergey. This is very much in line with what our colleagues are asking. Igor Zhukovsky is asking a similar question. How do experts evaluate the need for creating international rules or internationally accepted rules and practices as far as working on social media, something similar to the Viennese Convention on diplomacy? And certainly I would like to give the floor now to Pawel and Nick, and if you have something to say about this, I would really appreciate if you could make a few comments on that. Thank you.
Oleg, if I could jump in, I absolutely agree that we need to talk about this. And but what I've seen is that both in terms of digital diplomacy and also in terms of the attitude to the digital world in general, there's a reluctance to negotiate. I think we're seeing if we were talking about a typical battleground, right now, everybody thinks that their government can be the one to get to the high ground, you know? So people are looking for advantage. They're not looking for a kind of mutual stability. And so I would be in favor of negotiation around these kinds of activities. You know, even just a conversation about it, so that the countries, especially the countries that have conflictual, adversarial relationships online, are each aware of what the other one finds unpleasant, because I don't even think we're at that stage at the moment. There are many countries that feel they're the only one aggrieved by what other people put online. They don't have a sense that there's a mutual alienation going on. So I think this is an important conversation to have. And it goes to what I was saying earlier on about the need for, if media is weaponized, when we have a new weapon, we have a necessity for a negotiation process, a disarmament process associated with that weapon. And we have to begin a conversation around digital and online media, if those things are, as we see, weaponized. What that would look like, I don't know. And part of the problem with digital media is that the actors are not necessarily associated with nation states, but are at arm's length from nation states. So there's a lot of confusion as to whether somebody has an official status, is being encouraged to troll by a government. Even there have been government messages which haven't come from professional diplomats, but from interns. And that these messages have gone viral and are associated with a particular government's Twitter account. Matthias will remember the Canadian tweet about Crimea, which came from an intern and went viral and started a whole back and forth between the respective internet communities in Russia and the West. But I should pass the ball to Pawel and see what you think of the idea. You're still muted.
Павел, мы вас...
Okay, sorry about that. Moving from one screen to another, sometimes it's a little bit tricky. Okay, a couple of comments. Now, speaking about, to the best of my knowledge, there aren't any specific studies. There are conversations, but there are no studies of standards of digital diplomacy. There are studies indicating how particular politicians, and obviously Trump has been an excellent example, has used and abused digital spaces in order to implode public diplomacy, in order to undermine the values of democratic conduct, diplomatic conduct that basically was based on multilateralism. I mean, the amount of faux pas that can be counted looking at his Twitter account is enormous and just countless. It's an enormous source of data. One thing, however, that is a kind of source of optimism when it comes to standardization that I have recently encountered is basically a study of Brexit and how the European Union, 27 countries, have handled ways in which Twitter conversations took place. And it's a study that has been published in British Journal of Politics and International Relations. Now, possibly this is purely coincidental and followed the agenda of the European Union that was trying to promote and engage a kind of unified front in terms of negotiations with Britain. But the findings of this study basically indicate that EU27 diplomatic services in UK, because this is the study looking at the EU27 countries, United Kingdom, they closely reflected EU's negotiating framework and positions in the Brexit process, demonstrating a strong internal cohesiveness when it came to actually messaging and ways in which particular issues, foreign policy issues, were framed. So the kind of key significant findings that came out of that was that the main role in framing Brexit on social media has been left to EU representations in London, while individual missions and heads of missions have in most cases scarcely intervened in the discussions. Secondly, there's evidence of uniformity in framing. And I suppose uniformity would be one of those standards that basically can be talked about in this particular context. And then the last significant finding from a perspective of speaking of finding common denominators for diplomatic conversations on social media in this particular settings is the EU diplomatic entities have mostly not intervened in the negotiations or ratification process, with all actors mostly communicating about Brexit in a natural way with rare expressions of opinions on the topic. So there is a kind of evidence emerging that in a particular context, and this is basically this happens through across comparative studies, and they are very, very useful to kind of understand how countries approach particular diplomatic challenges through social media, and then we can talk about standards once we actually know and fully appreciate the differences between them. But as far as I'm concerned, the conversations about standardization of public diplomacy and its links with social media is at the stage of infancy, but at the same time there is something enjoyable about it. We like exploring humor in diplomacy. We like looking at Russian humor in diplomacy. So the lack of standards to academics, to students, to policymakers occasionally is kind of exciting. Once you start looking for ways of uniforming the practice, that might be challenging. So anyway, these are my thoughts.
But I don't think uniformity has to be boring. But I do think we need to have mutual standards of honesty. So something like looking at the problem of disruption via deep fakes, I think is a serious problem. But for people to agree they have to have a mutual interest in stability, and at the moment we don't have a mutual interest in stability. Rather, there's some countries have an interest in instability rather than stability. So finding a way for us to have a mutual to be interested in the same things, to have advantages in cooperation, has to be part of this too. And I wouldn't want to focus only on the media, because sometimes media is the symptom rather than the underlying disease. And there are fundamental disagreements right now which need to be talked about and need to be resolved. And the digital diplomacy is just dancing around the edges of these really fundamental questions.
Well, we're entering the era of politics, and I was kind of trying to, I was kind of trying to shy away from it. But one thing that I'm just gonna go back to the issue of skills that relates to the point that Nick has just made. We talk about digital skills and we talk about digital literacy skills. I think there is something to be said about relationship building in the realm of diplomacy that go outside of digital spaces. It's not only about the publics, it's also the abilities of public diplomats to build networks of safety, for example. Networks of support that basically can help you out at the time when you're basically undergoing crisis. So building competitive advantage through basically making sure that you can tap into a particular network really quickly, and this network will back you up at the times of crisis is something that is very, very important. And you guys talked about, your colleagues mentioned earlier on, the relationships with businesses, looking for innovation and engagement, normal interpersonal engagement, building stakeholder relationships with businesses, and looking for innovation and ways in which some of those computational challenges can be either highlighted or challenged is a skill in itself, and we don't seem to be talking about it, but it's also very, very important aspect of skill set that is very much needed. Yeah, anyway.
Спасибо, Ник. Спасибо, Павел.
Thank you so much, Pawel. Thank you so much, Nick. But certainly, we cannot avoid the question of norms and standards. And Matthias, this question goes to you. because you are monitoring not just separate countries and regions, but you're monitoring all the diplomats. Do you see any unwritten rules emerging? Probably some generally acknowledged types of behavior in the social media. Probably they would vary from social media to social media.
I don't see any initiative to create a digital Vienna Convention. Sorry, for the moment, it is really too confrontational and too diverse. I don't even know if we're able to codify the digital diplomacy relations. Yes, maybe we can. Is it a mutual following or is it a unilateral following, etc.? We could probably attempt to codify that, but that's about as far as you can go in terms of language. Unfortunately, Pandora's box has been opened with the last U.S. president, and there are other world leaders imitating him around the world, and using Twitter just as their personal to vent their anger. And look, there is not really who will tell them off apart from the platforms, and that's what Twitter has done, showing us who really has the power. Nick said legislators and legislators will have to deal with it. I wonder how they can rein in these social media companies, which as we see really have all the power. They can mute you, they can ban you for 24 hours, for a month, or forever. And that's where power lies. So I think what's really important in terms of relationship with these social media companies, governments and foreign ministries really have to have that tech ambassador, that relationship with the technology companies, and especially the social media companies.
But could I come back on this, Oleg? Because part of the problem here is that we have to understand the nature of the medium. And the nature of this digital medium is that it's possible to speak to foreigners as a diplomat, but also to speak to your own country simultaneously. So we have a lot of examples online of diplomats kind of showing off to a domestic audience by confronting foreigners and saying undiplomatic things. And here, I think the most obvious example are things that Chinese diplomats are saying, and what we're calling now wolf warrior diplomacy, where confrontational things are put on Twitter deliberately to entertain the domestic audience and to give the domestic audience the sort of the spectacle of a confrontational and strong diplomat going out and looking after the interests of the nation state. And this is it does have parallels in history, but I think it is a fresh problem at this magnitude, and maybe something that we need to think about, because what does the diplomat lose in the world right now if they do this, if they promote their own position within their own country through this kind of confrontational diplomacy? So I feel very challenged by that.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. How do we rein that in? That is the key question.
Спасибо, коллеги. У нас еще один вопрос.
Thank you so much, colleagues. There is one question which goes to Nicholas Cull. Olga Korsnyak sends you her best greetings, and to elaborate on what you have already said. By means of digital media, diplomats can overcome the filter of mediators represented by news agencies or some media mediators, meaning that they can turn directly to the broader audience. And usually it's been noted as a positive thing. So why diplomats are using social media? Because they can embrace directly a broader audience. But as you already said, this can create some negative ramifications. How? By means of social media, you can avoid the mediators. Probably mediators were positive for communication. What do you think?
Well, I think that's a very good point. one of the problems with the transition to social media has been that we see exactly this phenomenon of diplomats trying to use social media to do what they did in the past. So using social media as an extension of the press conference, as an extension of broadcasting, rather than seeing the opportunity to develop relationships and to see the multilateral, multi-directional capabilities of social media. So it's not uncommon, or when digital diplomacy began, it was actually quite common for an embassy to not be following anybody, to effectively not be listening to any other party in its feed, and that was advertised right in the top corner of the screen when you were looking at their Twitter profile. Or second scenario was that they were following people, but they were only following people in their own country. And the job of a diplomat is supposed to be to engage with people beyond the country, and the ability of diplomats to use the willingness of diplomats to use the technology to listen, I think has been understated. And what I like to see is when a diplomat uses social media as they would use a room at a party, where rather than just broadcasting, standing in the middle of the room and shouting at everybody, they are listening to different people and they're retweeting and saying, well, I think that this is important to this group, this is important to this group. And they provide, when you see a diplomat providing a service to a particular idea. So a good example of this would be the British diplomat John Duncan, who was empowered by the British Foreign Ministry now 10 years ago to be ambassador to arms control. So he was allowed to, his job was to be in Geneva negotiating about arms control, but he also did that on Twitter. And he didn't have to go back to London to ask for each permission for each tweet or retweet. He was empowered to be part of a real conversation. And I think this is a good model, empowering diplomats to talk about and be citizens of a particular online conversation, so that they don't feel that all they have to do is speak in agreed sound bites, but rather can facilitate a discussion, which is, I think, what they do best, is this job of listening and cross-introducing and facilitating and helping a discussion be more than it would be without their presence. To me, that's the ideal. And just because the medium allows you to present a slogan to thousands and thousands of people simultaneously doesn't mean that it's in your best interest to do that. But what do my colleagues think of this? That's just my reaction, Olga. But thank you for the question.
Спасибо большое, Ник.
Thank you so much, Nick. Actually, we have one more question. It is quite general, but it follows the topic which we are discussing from different angles. Lilia Tassos, I'm not sure whether this is a nickname or her real name, but she speaks about potential legislation for global cyberspace, and she says that it's strange there is no such piece of legislation. Just cyber crimes are being prosecuted, and that's it. And Pawel already said that, in essence, we are speaking about unregulated digital space. Well, some things cannot be regulated, and now we just spoke about the rules for digital diplomacy, how to communicate, and I've invented one rule. Whether you agree with that basic rule, I can offer that it should be clear if a diplomat says something on social media, then the Ministry of Foreign Affairs cannot refuse that or give it up, so this becomes official. So, and therefore, the diplomats would be very cautious and they would avoid certain language because they would know that it can be used against them, so to say. But this way or the other way, we said that it's very difficult to regulate these things because there are lots of accounts, but what we can regulate, probably I would get back to Mikhail Petrosyan. He spoke about interaction with the business. One of the fields of interaction with business is related to regulation. This regulation in different countries is different. I'm not prompting you to thinking that we can come up with some common regulation, but Mikhail, can you elaborate on that? Thank you so much, Oleg. Well, as far as in my past background, I'm an international lawyer. I was lucky to attend the United Nations International Law Commission sessions, which developed all the international tools and brought for consideration different countries and states, and that translated into the conventions. I think that bearing in mind the polarity of opinions, different stakeholders vary and do not share common thinking, all that, I don't think that there is any possibility that we may come up with some common regulation. The moment is not opportune, the time is not ripe, but I think that, well, the night is young. It depends on what common law builds around it before we translate that into a text. We have to come up with certain terms and language, and probably it will cause a lot of disagreements. We have to come up with some common norms of the international rule. But we are there to see that yet. What the national regulators think of that? They actually came up with some regulatory sandbox with that idea. Since 2021, we have a new regimen related to some pilot of a regulatory sandbox. It means that the government agrees that for a certain range of people or entities, for certain contexts, some pilot regimen would be introduced on a temporary basis. And probably this may be true of the interstate relations, because actually this is about what the state is ready to do. Well, the business would take a decision very promptly following the risk analysis. And the same is true of the public sector and the commercial sector. Well, the experts from the private side have a totally different responsibility, whereas the public authorities have to be very cautious. Probably some experimental regimen can be tested. Some clusters of relations could be proposed, but at least I don't see any comprehensive piece of legislation to regulate us here. The states are not prepared for that, and the field itself, the media itself is not ready for that. But let's wait and see what happens there once the habits unfold, and we'll see what red lines are there, the ones which cannot be crossed. And the Council of Europe is discussing the artificial intelligence. Other platforms also are dwelling on that. Ethics codes are being discussed. In terms of ethics, I think that it would be subjected to multiple discussions. That would be a very crucial element of the digital diplomacy and public diplomacy. And again, it varies from country to country. What is being allowed in one country is unlikely to be allowed in another, especially bearing in mind the uncertainty in which we live. And this is what was referred to by Pawel and others. Actually, that this is a problem for decades to come, especially once we look at how the international law evolved and developed before. Probably I'm a pessimist, but not always you have to come up with certain regulations, meaning that we can agree on certain areas where the prospects are good. Thank you so much, Michael. So if we get back to that question, so probably the countries failed to agree on that because this is not a piece of cake and it takes a lot of time. We have one more question from our viewer for Sergey Kiryushin. It goes to Sergey Kiryushin. Can we say that Russia, in its digital diplomacy strategy and digitalization of the foreign ministry, is guided by certain countries which have some approved documents in that area? Mr. Kiryushin? Well, I already said that we are just in our infancy, elaborating our concept as how we are going to promote digital transformation. So there is now yet some common approach to that. Well, I think that anyway, as far as all the countries are present in the same digital media, we are all learning from each other. And speaking about the use of social media, many countries learned from each other, and it has become a versatile practice. Colleagues, I'm responsible for digital transformation. For diplomats, and actually this is the information of media and digital, headed by Maria Zakharova. They're responsible for some rules and accounts in the social media. So this is my topic. This doesn't fall in my realm. It has nothing to do with the digital transformation. Okay, it was just my comment, not a question. We are close to an end, and actually, among the questions to be discussed, we spoke about the threats entailed by the use of technologies for foreign policy. These questions have already been touched upon.
Вопрос и уточнить заострить на том, какая главная возможность.
So we need to look at the main opportunity and the main threat. And I would like to direct this question to all of these speakers today and hear your opinion about looking at this through the lens of your approaches that you are promoting. What does it look like? What is the main opportunity that opens up, and what is the main threat that exists in the sphere of diplomacy? And I would like to start with Pawel.
Или нет?
Or not.
Да, если кто-то готов высказаться, вот.
If somebody's ready to speak on this topic, the main opportunity and the main threat, I would like to give you the floor if you ask for one.
Павел, мы вас не слышим.
We cannot hear you, Pawel.
Right. Sorry about that. I suppose I mentioned already I mentioned an opportunity which I consider as the most significant, a policy-driven. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry, I think there is a bit of a delay. Can you guys hear me?
Да, слышно, слышно.
Yes, we can hear you. We could hear you.
Сейчас не слышно.
We can hear you now.
Ну, может быть, тогда Ник пока.
Okay, sorry.
Maybe in the meantime, Nick can do this.
Internet connection possibly is playing up. Can you hear me now?
Да.
So, okay.
Yes, we can
I
hear you.
mentioned one opportunity that I consider as the biggest one, an attempt to basically think about resolving issues of digitalization of diplomacy using diplomacy itself, coalition building in order to address issues of misinformation and disinformation, issues of handling data and targeting individuals through campaigning in the context of diplomacy. That's something that I think it's particularly important to be addressed and thought about. Commercial use of data that is derived and very frequently scraped for diplomatic purposes. That's another issue that I think is very, very significant. So building a sense of coalition between countries who are interested in taking it on board as a foreign aspect of foreign policy, driving it forward, developing a thought leadership, developing a coalition of academic, policymaker, civic society organizations that are going to support those kind of efforts. This is, to my mind, the biggest opportunity in order to kind of make a leap to overcome this potential wave of disruption that the politics of uncertainty that digital diplomacy has brought about. When it comes to the threat, I mean, there are obviously several ones, but threats are usually very, very personal. And the thing that worries me the most is obviously the thing that I take personally very, very seriously. I think it's data handling and ways in which basically diplomats, potentially from foreign countries, can basically use my personal data in order to target me more effectively, to push content that is going to be seen as more relevant. So using algorithmic solutions in order to influence me as an individual. That's something that I'm kind of concerned about on a personal level.
Спасибо, Павел.
Thank you, Pawel. Nicholas, you also wanted to say a few words.
Sure. Well, to me, the opportunity we have is an opportunity for collaboration based on the technology. And if you think about it, the problems we face right now are too big for any one country to deal with, too big for any one actor to deal with. So the only way we can move forward on the problems we share of climate, problems of the pandemic, is through collaboration. I think that there's also opportunities of great transparency coming from the digital technology, great opportunities for understanding, and that we can use this as a mechanism for international exchange and for connecting people who fundamentally understand each other. Peer-to-peer connection is essential, but the threat is that rather than bringing people together, these technologies are dividing us, and even dividing us in ways we don't understand, because the division is built into the architecture. And I see polarization as a tremendous problem, but I think that individuals there are things we can do to help, to be good. We have to think about not only our rights as digital citizens, but our responsibilities, and to talk it with our own populations about making sure of the integrity of things that we share. And one of my colleagues here in the US talks about informational distancing and says, look, we know about social distancing when we're encountering people, but how about information distancing when we're encountering facts, and thinking about which stories we share, which stories we pass on, and what our responsibility is as netizens to be part of the digital environment that we would prefer. So I don't think we should just ask diplomats to fix the whole thing, but citizens should take responsibility for, sorry, the BBC has interrupted. But in a way, that's not completely inappropriate, because finding news and sharing news that comes from respected sources is one of the good things that I think we can do as citizens online, and holding back from material that's entertaining but not from credible sources.
Matthias, тот же самый вопрос.
Matthias, the same question for you, the main threats and the key opportunities that exist.
Только мы вас пока не слышим. Ну или, по крайней мере, я не
We
слышу.
cannot hear you for now. Or maybe it's just me.
Matthias, we cannot hear you. You're muted.
Странно почему-то. Ну давайте пока
Strange. For some reason, we cannot hear him. And maybe in the meantime, Mikhail can take the floor, and Matthias will follow suit. I think the main threat now is that we are now relying on technologies, and at the critical moment, they are letting us down. I think that's the threat that we need to be cognizant of. Matthias, I will try to stall while you are setting up your microphone. I think the main opportunity, if we're looking at the use of digital technologies in executing international policy, I believe that the main advantage and the main asset here is that if the data-driven approach is going to be used, this will allow us to be much more effective in utilizing the potential that we always have within our diplomatic agencies. This will allow us to increase the effectiveness of the decisions we take, to ensure that they are better aligned, more consistent, that they have this 360-degree view when they inform certain decisions. And digital technologies will allow us to rethink our overall approach to managing and governing foreign policy. If they are introduced in this field, there are risks that exist, of course, and they are associated with what Oleg was speaking about. I'm referring to the fact that if we try to go too far and try and give leeway to these algorithms and allow them to assume too much responsibility than they basically should, there's the classical dilemma of how far you would like to automate your decisions. You need to achieve the right balance. Who is the ultimate decision maker in decision making, or whether there is a certain array of data that can be given to machines to use in order to make decisions. It's important not to go too far and not to play with fire here, so to speak. We need to find the right balance in decision making between the human mind and the algorithms and the neural networks that somebody has already mentioned here already, and other technological opportunities that exist. That's the essence and the solution that our current managers can use, and future generations as well. Thank you so much, Mikhail. Matthias, have you been able to fix your microphone?
Hello, can you hear me?
мы слышим.
Yes, you
Да.
can. Oh, sorry
Yes,
for
we
that.
can hear you.
These are the usual Zoom problems. Sorry, I just wanted to say I fully agree with Pawel and Nick. You know, what we really need is digital collaboration, digital coalition building, really better, better understanding of each other. And I think this is a great example. Just this kind of these kind of digital meetings, discussions. I really enjoy them. My dream was always to convene a digital diplomacy summit in Geneva, here in Geneva, under the auspices of the UN, or at least in the Palais des Nations, because there's enough space. But I think nowadays we can actually do this, on Zoom, on the digital platforms. But we all have to agree to connect with each other, and I think this is the first step before we can then talk about any standards of digital engagement, digital interaction. But I think this is definitely something we will have to do, because we cannot let this be an open space for confrontation. That is not what we want this web, this internet to be. That's my. Thank you very much for having me.
Спасибо большое. И,
Thank you so much. And going back to Sergey, I'd like to say that we spoke more about public diplomacy today, but if we go back to your realm, digital transformation of foreign organizations, foreign agencies, what is the main threat and main opportunity that you see in this field?
С тем, что говорили коллеги. Социальные сети – это, безусловно, мощнейший инструмент для того, чтобы политическое ведомство могло как решать задачи очень активно, но как любой инструмент, как мы знаем, он может служить во благо и нет.
It can be used as a tool or as a weapon.
Просим прощения, перевод почему-то слетел, и сейчас мы слышим на русский английский звук.
В этой связи, безусловно, для начала необходимо будет
Very important to continue the work that we do, defining the objectives of digital transformation. And we need to interact very closely with the various departments of the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, such as the Department for Information and Press. And we also need to understand the strategic objectives that we have and need to attain, some focus areas where we would need to go to, and we need to try to make sure that our efforts are supported by our digital capabilities and our digital instruments. And without a doubt, I do support my colleague's suggestion that we need to discuss the issue of digital diplomacy and the issue of interaction between various countries and the ministries for foreign affairs of various countries. That this agenda should be elevated to the international level, that it should be part of the discussion that will be going on, and we need to try to develop certain rules and approaches to effective interaction with each other. And let me also repeat myself. This is the kind of tool that is provided to us by digital technologies, social media. This is the tool set that allows us to interact with each other more fully and more effectively. And this is the kind of interaction that we need to beef up. But it also should be somehow standardized to ensure that it is most effective and to minimize the risks that might arise as a result of these of such technologies as deep fake and other negative things that exist on the internet. Thank you so much for your comment, Mr. Kiryushin. We have a few moments left before we are to be closed. I would like to thank the speakers taking this opportunity. I'd like to say that we've really had a very good coverage of a lot of different topics that are related to digital diplomacy. And in conclusion, I'd like to say that despite the fact that despite the challenges that we're faced with in this area, in the current situation where these challenges and problems are out in the open, we shouldn't forget about the opportunities that are open to us by the internet and work with data. And digital technologies provide us with connectivity, with greater connectivity, and this discussion could become one of the stepping stones towards further discussions of these issues. And these are not the kind of things that are happening naturally, and we need to think of ideas that could be proposed to build this cooperation on the national and international levels using information and communication technologies. With that, I would like to thank you all. I would like to thank our spectators and those who sent us questions. And now I would give the microphone back over to Ms. Lobanova, who is the deputy. director for the Gorchakov Fund. And I would like to simply thank all of the experts who joined us today, despite the difference in time zones and despite their busy schedules. And nevertheless, we're very thankful to you for being with us, for paying attention to our event. Although we met some of you for the first time at this event, it's a great pleasure, and we hope that we're going to be able to continue this discussion one way or another, and we would be extremely delighted if you would be able to take part in other of our events. We conduct events like this on a regular basis, including meetings for young and junior diplomats from various countries, and I think this is going to be quite useful for them to learn about all of this information that is available today, about the things that you spoke about today, about your personal opinion, the opinion of professionals in this field, of people who have in-depth knowledge of these issues. I would like to thank you all. Oleg, thank you for your professional moderation and for facilitating, and would like to thank our interpreters who worked with us for these several hours. And the meeting was recorded, and we would really appreciate if you would share this with your organizations on your organization's websites. And until we see you again, thank you again one more time.
Bye.
Thank you.